Today's presentation is an attempt to explore systems and factors of influence in behavioral outcomes. Much discussion today will occur in relation to examining individual, situational, and systemic factors in behavior with an overarching focus on the systemic. In applying Zimbardo's concept of complex human behavior factors leading to behavioral outcomes, this exploration seeks to view the interplay of effect in the urban environment. We've chosen to view this experiment within the urban environment as it has proven the richest field of study. Most social programs regarding housing, policing, community supports, and state-sponsored messaging have taken place in the urban environment due to the highest presence of disadvantaged populations, variance of cultures, and immediacy of messaging and visible social order controls, either beneficial or detrimental. The main filters through which we will observe this are the following. First, community supports, specifically focusing on youth and gender. Second, neighborhood vigilance, accountability, and support. Third, PSAs and in-group civility and how that affects through solidarity, an environmental effect. And fourth, police and the perception of control and safety. A lot of that through the broken windows policing theory. So what factors assist in promoting pro-social behaviors? In observing the systemic factors in human behavior within this exercise, we are going to explore the roles of community supports, neighborhood vigilance, and accountability. To further gauge efficacy of these propositions, can issues of in-group preference, solidarity, and perception play a role? The perceptions of control and safety may differ based on community interpretation and perception of police or governmental influence in community dynamics, bringing to mind the idea that systemic influence may not always be as effective when constructed as when evolved and self-maintained. Philip Zimbardo posits that there are three complex human behavior factors that lead to behavioral outcomes. He says, I make explicit that any analysis of complex human behavior demands a tripart focus. These are dispositional or internal, situational or external, or systemic. According to Zimbardo, he says, a major task of psychological science is to explain behavioral variance, often by determining the extent to which these observed behavior can be attributed to internal variables, such as individual differences, to external situation-based variables, and to their interaction. The interplay of effect between these factors is something that requires scrutiny based on historical misattribution of influence, whose intent may be referred to at a later point. Zimbardo elaborates that people and situations are usually in a state of dynamic interaction. So to assign the genesis of a behavior to one specific influence may not be useful or particularly accurate. For example, the assignation of blame in prison abuse narratives was useful in shielding from systemic factors that were well constructed in that environment. Investigative probing was used to dispel the bad apples explanation of dispositional behavioral variances used by psychologists, military, and administrations. For example, in the Abu Ghraib prison abuses. In these cases, systemic factors must be considered in a phenomenon referred to as top-down analysis. So this calls for an observation of the role of specific environmental risk factors in contributing to these abuses and the underestimation of situational factors. If we are to look at the systemic factors and influence of behavioral outcomes, let's look at the tendencies of connection between the dispositional or individual and the situational or systemic. As youth tends to be initially perceived as the most vulnerable population of influence, and we have decided to use the urban environment as the setting for this observation, then let's delve into the effect of community supports on youth and how they may differ and coincide. If we are adopting a top-down analysis approach, where does this influence come together, and where does it veer? What are the factors that branch out in different forms of influence? So let's look at community supports and how they affect youth and how they veer in regard to gender. So when attempting to discover more about the systems of influence, one may want to look at the first system, that's family, and how that may play out in community. So when observing bonding systems in relation to violent behaviors of youth, right, it was noted that there may be a connection to community and influence, and yet this may vary in effect by gender. It's at this intersection that a study was created examining gender-sensitive models with adolescent violent behavior by testing multiple bonding systems in adolescents' environment. If we're to study the effect of community influence as a systemic top-down influence, then it must be important to monitor how the cycle deviates from the journey, from the top down, as it were. Notably, gender appears to divert throughout the participants in this theory. So if you see here, both peer bonding and school bonding have an effect in decreasing violent behavior of both male and female youth. However, some different bonding systems were found to be effective only for a certain gender. It's community bonding for male youth and parental bonding for female youth. So here we see that these bonding systems can be effective in urban areas as a deterrent to violence and perceived social deviance. We can take Zimbardo's philosophy that this may not be a case of individual internal variables and move past in order to identify situational and systemic influences. That may help to understand the possibilities of support for individuals. Yet, from the systemic perspective, once studied, we can differentiate between gender and identify the systems from top down that best assist in pro-social behaviors, accountability, or deterrence to violent behavior. Bonding to various extents is shown to assist in this understanding. Influence is not always positive. Influence from peers can be negative and encouraging of harmful behaviors. We cannot determine the intent of influence, but observe its effectiveness as presented. The questions may be asked as to whether these influences are protective or aggressive. This study notes that relationships between parents and friends influence male and females differently as risk factors. However, it's clear that these relationships can easily become protective factors if they're positive ones. Hence, the idea of bonding tends towards the protective, inclusive, and supportive, whereas influence can be multi-directional. So protective influences can be found to be cross-gendered in that adaptability, problem-solving ability, and resourcefulness as individual protective factors, and family involvement, authoritative parenting, and family-level protective factors are for both genders. Again, the difference in gender may be noted in that strong bonding to their school is a significant protective factor for boys, while strong bonding to family is a significant protective factor for girls. When moving past to other influences in relation to the effect of violent behaviors in regard to gender, while religious and non-sport activity reduces delinquency among males but not females, as opposed to other research findings, sports activities help reduce delinquency among females but not males. So could it be said that spiritual empowerment appeals to males while a physical empowerment appeals to females? Males tend to define by separation, while females define by connection. This may pave the way for looking at relational theory in male and female observation. The underpinning of the theory is very different from the prior psychological explanation of the process of maturity, since that explanation was based on a path of maturity of a male, which is separation, rather than connection or bonding. And so it's these community supports, protective factors, and bonding that appear significant for young women specifically. If looking at outcomes, if a girl cannot afford a meaningful connection or bonding with others, a healthy psychological development is not expected. If separation is shown to be a red flag, does this disconnect pave the way for capacity towards antisocial behaviors? Moving toward attempting to identify bonding that may influence top-down toward antisocial behavior, we can turn to the social disorganization theory. Social disorganization theory explains that the cause of crimes through environmental factors, including bonding between the individual adolescent and the community in which he or she resides. This is an important move toward the situational factor in Zimbardo's tripart focus. The theory assumes that the crime and delinquency increase when there is disorganization in society. This disorganization may have the capacity to be constructed as we further explore systemic factors. In other words, if there's a weak bonding between individual youth and their community because of the disconnectedness amongst members in the community, then there are more crimes. The lack of top-down influence may be observed here to leave individuals open to exploring unguided and perhaps more antisocial behaviors. In attempting to better understand the outcomes attached to these observations, a main objective is to determine the relative importance of neighborhoods, families, and peers for both positive and negative adolescent outcomes. So, neighborhood vigilance, accountability, and support. Jane Jacobs was an activist who worked within urban studies, sociology, and economics in the 1950s and 60s primarily. Her 1961 book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, is a criticism of American urban planning and the decline of neighborhood building. At the time, many American neighborhoods were being planned as isolative, suburban, and privatized spaces that did not encourage flourishing connection. Jane Jacobs' Eyes on the Street is a philosophy of community accountability as opposed to isolation as a breeding ground for uncivil behavior. The two most prevalent questions being asked in the discussion are based in this writing. The first question, this study focuses on the influence of the central feature of urban social ecology, active streets, on the prevalence of severe violent crime in a large urban area. Two key questions motivated the analysis. First, to what extent and how do active streets influence violent crime rates at the neighborhood level? In describing the movement and presence of active streets as a feature, its presence is seen in the possibility of protective bonding agent and sanctuary. This is an evolved and self-maintained structure that resonates and holds its inhabitants. If we were to look at the top-down factor of influence, can the community serve as a regulator? The highly influential discussion of Jacobs' 1961 Eyes on the Streets as a social control mechanism in urban neighborhoods points to an important regulatory role of active streets. There must be a certain elements present in order for this to be effective. Jacobs notes that density is an important enabler of this system in that. Neighborhoods benefit only when a sufficient density of active streets has been achieved. At very low levels, increases in the prevalence of active streets may offer little more than additional potential targets for victimization. The nonlinear relationship between active streets and exposure to violence was reproduced in analysis of both administrative data and homicide and independently collected data on household-level victimization. This bears witness to the efficacy not only of what becomes visible on the street, but activities taking place within homes. This pervasive feeling of accountability and protection within a strongly bonded community becomes apparent as a systemic approach. Again, this is one that is evolved and self-maintained, not constructed. So question 2. Is the relationship between active streets and violent crime conditional on neighborhood social organizations, specifically on levels of anonymity and collective efficacy within urban neighborhoods? The alignment of intent is something that bears into the concept of evolved and self-maintained community. Jacobs, for instance, suggested that active streets are likely to produce better monitoring and street control only when neighborhood residents share the value of a crime-free public realm and maintain confidence that neighbors will back them up when intervention becomes necessary. It's this feeling of protection and community support that carries out into the belief that approach of mutual goals and direction in community. These are referred to as informal social control norms. As a forerunner to collective efficacy theory, the Jacobs model integrates social organizational characteristics in urban neighborhoods. These are informal social control norms. With explicit attention to the social ecologies necessary for neighborhood social organization to exert regulatory effects on crime. This balance of mutualistic support depends on the presence and intent of community members for the possibility of social control to exist. It's this marriage of systemic, situational, and dispositional. This unity is effective as a deterrent. The community members may serve as a situational deterrent to criminal activity, given that potential offenders are uncertain regarding the intervention capacity of that social environment. The effect on individual families plays into the idea that it takes a village to raise a child. When an urban community becomes bonded, the outcomes in youth are significantly improved. Parental monitoring and peer quality are higher in neighborhoods with greater collective efficacy, which also moderates the effect of parental monitoring on both youth and outcomes. The weaving of family and community can be an evolution in that youth development is bolstered by a family growing into the strength of a supportive community system. The fact that parental monitoring is higher in neighborhoods with greater collective efficacy supports claims that parents adjust their parenting style to conform to neighborhood norms. The efficacy of informal social control norms in promoting pro-social behavior, establishing bonding, and community support that is protective is one that's evolved and self-maintained, not constructed. Alternately, there have been systemic approaches which are constructed and developed. So let's take a look at some of these. Police and perceptions of control and safety through the lens of broken windows policing. In a police presence exploration, we may see the ultimate expression of constructed systemic factors of control. This idea challenges assumptions about the impact of criminal activities upon perceptions of safety and contributes insights into the unintended effects of formal controls that have implications for our understanding of local social order. A 1982 article in Atlantic Monthly by James Wilson and George Kelling suggested that targeting minor disorder could help reduce more serious crime. This has since been referred to as broken windows policing. This approach was embraced in urban areas, specifically New York and Chicago, in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The three most populous cities in the United States, New York, Chicago, and most recently Los Angeles, have all adopted at least some aspect of Wilson and Kelling's theory, primarily through more aggressive enforcement of minor misdemeanors. This refers back to the idea of perception alluded to in Jane Jacobs' approach. However, in this case, dominant assumptions implied that this policy shift concerning the reassurance function of policing, important in these theoretically informed policy debates, is the idea that the police and their partners through symbolic communications can influence the extent to which individuals perceive that order and security exists within these urban spaces. Nonetheless, the policy was widely accepted based on theory rather than practical application, more symbolic as a reassuring presence than as a deterrent. This element became widely adopted in urban areas. For the first decade of the millennium, reassurance policing assumed a prominent place in the urban safety policies. The perception of control is viewed as valuable in both of these scenarios, and yet the question is posed as to its efficacy based on who presents the perception. Jacobs testifies to the efficacy of the evolved and self-maintained informal social control norms, but the broken windows policing may suggest the exact opposite. Before delving into the value of human experience, let's look at efficacy. So according to a recent National Research Council report, existing research does not provide strong support for the broken windows hypothesis. There's a widespread perception among police policymakers and the public that enforcement strategies, primarily arrest, applied broadly against offenders committing minor offenses, lead to a reduction in serious crime. Research does not provide strong support for this proposition. So why do people want so badly to believe that this is effective when it is shown not to be? Do formal social controls provide the perception that a more protective assurance from a distance that informal social controls in a more intimate community. It can be hard to perceive from a distance and have faith as an observer. Some crime statistics dropped significantly in the decade that this policy was adopted. If that's the case, how can the policy be seen as ineffective? Before we start touting the gains of broken windows policing, let's look at the many other factors that weigh into the drop in criminal behavior. At the time, other factors that are situational in nature may weigh in on these statistical changes. For example, the city's drop in crime should be tied to a low unemployment from a booming economy, or decline in crack cocaine use that plagued the 1980s. The demographic reality that the proportion of young males, the most common offenders to the general population, had dropped. When observing the results of this policy, taken together, the evidence from New York City and the 5-city social experiment provides no support for a simple first-order disorder-crime relationship as hypothesized by Wilson and Kelling, nor for the proposition that broken windows policing is the optimal use of the scarce law enforcement resources. If the community is not self-sustaining and not protected or bolstered by the police presence, is the environment poisoned, and therefore a retreat from the environment may provide more positive results to the individual. This is another approach to the systemic, situational, and dispositional factors aligning into an attempt. So what if all external factors change and we're left with a self or dispositional in the new environment? This program, the Moving to Opportunity program, in these same cities, proposed moving at-risk populations out of difficult environments. So under this program, approximately 4,600 low-income families living in high-crime public housing communities characterized by high rates of social disorder were randomly assigned housing vouchers to move to less disadvantaged and disorderly communities. Under this line of reasoning, the individual may find a community that has evolved and is self-sustaining with seemingly informal social controls that benefit the community, as described by Jane Jacobs. However, it's here that the individual can find space to flourish and find community supports, but this is the constructed individual as opposed to the constructed community. The result of this approach to top-down factors was an alienation from the environment that could not be constructed or implied. So MTO changed multiple aspects of people's neighborhoods. MTO families moved to neighborhoods that were less disorderly, but also had fewer lower-income families and more high-status households. This induced gentrification does not appear to result in reducing criminal behavior. Revisiting the solidarity and in-group effect on pro-social behavior, one might find a further alienation in newly placed populations and communities that do not have similar bonding or value systems. It's here that the perception of control and opportunity when constructed does not appear to have the same efficacy as community supports that are evolved and self-sustained. The data from the MTO experiment reveals that moving to a less disorderly, less disadvantaged community on balance does not appear to reduce criminal behavior among MTO program populations. The constructed top-down approach does not prove to have taken effect, even though the perceived theoretic result may seem clear from a distance. Similarly, the perceived safety of broken windows policing, the effect does not have roots in actual application, as human support and bonding cannot be constructed. The deterrent effect on crime and police patrols is negligible. Considering reduction of visible streets patrolled justified by evidence that they had little direct impact on crime rates, the reassurance gap was noted by senior police managers. In this case, the opposite proved to be true. The intention was not only not effective, but the feeling of safety and support was reestablished in the removal of these present forces. So PSAs and in-group civility, solidarity, and environmental effect. If communities are more effective in terms of pro-social behaviors when operating autonomously within the community support and protective principles of informal social norms, what establishes civility, and who tends to be included in this? What is the systemic construct that identifies the members of the group and the situational applications? What keeps people civil, and to whom? Civility is prosocial behavior regulated by unspoken social norms. However, few studies have focused on the determinants of civility in urban contexts. The aim of this study was to test the influence of sex, passerby density, and social categorization on civility. So results in these studies indicated the influence of the experimenter sex and the density of passersby on civility. So studies 2 and 3 did not provide evidence for the hypothesis of in-group favoritism as predicted by social identity theories. Reinforcing some of Jane Jacobs' theories once more, the level of density and activity at street levels tends to bear on the engagement of community-focused behaviors within informal social norms. These are established by the community itself. To whom does this apply? There appears to be an in-group favoritism in regard to street-level community intervention and pro-social behavior. In homogeneous cultures, this can be viewed through the lens of solidarity, and yet in more diverse populations, there appears to be a variance in pro-social behaviors, although in-group favoritism still persists based on a greater capacity for empathy. A systemic approach may be evidenced by PSAs or other systemic social messaging. Once more, a constructed approach, although altruistic in intent, may not be as effective. This theme is current as great pressure and social demand are being carried out by governmental and non-governmental organizations on the need for cooperative and supportive conduct by the citizens. Advertising campaigns and social actions sponsored by different sectors emphasize the need for civility and socially responsible conduct. Although demanded by citizens, the application of this from the top-down factor in messaging may aid in awareness of resources or programs, but less so in direct behavioral effect. So with the exception of residential stability, no neighborhood variable had a direct effect on either pro-social competency or problem behavior, while several indirect effects were observed. The ability to adopt new behavioral outcomes tends to be more of a result of situational factors in this example than of systemic. The adoption of these behaviors is often influenced by characteristics of the social situation, such as number of people involved and group stereotypes. The involvement of community supports is a necessary factor for the adoption and the survival of this systemic factor in top-down effect on behavioral outcomes within the urban environment. So today's presentation is an attempt to explore the systems and factors of influence in behavioral outcomes. In examining individual, situational, and systemic factors in behavior with an overarching focus on systemic, we see over and over again the importance of community, evolved and self-sustaining systems that cannot be replicated, reproduced, or substituted by constructed systems with the same efficacy. In applying Zimbardo's concept of complex human behavior factors leading to behavioral outcomes, this exploration seeks to present the interplay of effect in the urban environment. We've chosen to view this experiment within the urban environment as it has proven the richest field of study. Most social programs regarding housing, policing, community supports, and state-sponsored messaging have taken place in the urban environment due to the highest presence of disadvantaged populations, variance of cultures, and immediacy of messaging and visible social controls, either beneficial or detrimental. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.